It's just past 7:30 in the evening across India. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll bring you the day's big stories from across India and the world. I'm Tanvi Taneja. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is my colleague, Nick Harper. Nick, good to have you with us.
Morning, Tanvi. Great to be here. It's 9 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. It's 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, protests in Israel to get hostages released. We'll have the details. And in the US, Trump and Haley prepare to go head-to-head again this weekend as they fight for the White House. But first, the headlines.
Mourners chant Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's name as he is cremated in Moscow. US and French ambassadors to Russia, among other diplomats, attend the funeral service. Donald Trump and Nikki Haley fight it out for Washington's Republican presidential primary. Trump's lawyers to seek delay of classified documents case in Florida and election interference case in Georgia. WTO talks deadlocked in Abu Dhabi with no breakthrough in sight. India pushing for agri-reforms and refusal for extending a moratorium on digital trade tariffs. Global carbon dioxide emissions from energy hit a record high last year, says the International Energy Agency. In China, energy-related emissions rose by 5.2%, in contrast to the US, where it fell by 4.1%. The funeral of late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was held in Moscow. Foreign diplomats, including the US and French ambassadors to Russia, attended the funeral service for Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in Moscow on Friday. Navalny died on February 16th in an Arctic penal colony where he was serving sentences totaling more than 30 years. Meanwhile, Kremlin earlier said any unsanctioned gatherings near the church where Navalny was cremated was a violation of law. Police officers also patrolled the cemetery where over 1,000 people gathered to bid their farewell to Navalny. Next, latest from the Russia-Ukraine conflict now. Russia on Thursday released video of its forces capturing a new position in Ukraine's Robotoin town in Zaporizhia. Russian ministry said the army had taken control of the village in Petrovoskoye in the direction of Avdiivka, occupying a more favorable position. Meanwhile, Ukraine allegedly downed a Russian fighter jet in the east. The country's forces also carried out strikes on Russian military personnel and equipment concentration areas. Russia has denied any plans to deploy nuclear weapons in space, and his defense minister has refuted US's claims that Russia was developing a nuclear capability for space. Although President Vladimir Putin told Russia's Security Council that neutralization of threats in space must remain in spotlight for the nation. Earlier on Thursday, Putin, in his annual State of the Nation address in Moscow, warned that any escalation by NATO could trigger the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. India has expressed shock at the loss of lives in northern Gaza on Thursday. In a shooting incident at an aid distribution point in Gaza, at least 104 people were killed and over 700 injured. The Ministry of External Affairs said, and I quote, "We are deeply shocked at the loss of lives in northern Gaza yesterday during delivery of humanitarian assistance. Such loss of civilian lives and the larger humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to be a cause for extreme concern. We reiterate our call for safe and timely delivery of humanitarian aid and assistance." Meanwhile, families of Israeli hostages carried on with their march for the third day from the city of Beit Shemesh towards Jerusalem, the seat of the Israeli government. My colleague Nick Harper is in Washington, D.C. He gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Nick, this march demonstrating the unified call for action of these families.
Absolutely, Tanvi, that's right. On the third day of their protest march to Jerusalem, Israelis carried 134 stretchers bearing the names and the photos of all the hostages still being held in Gaza. In Tel Aviv, protesters called on the US administration to do more to bring about a ceasefire deal that would ensure their release. Separately, a protest outside the US embassy in Tel Aviv called on US President Joe Biden to lead the warring sides to an agreement that would bring about the release of the hostages. The European Commission has stated that it will hold back part of a payment of nearly $89 million for the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency. It would, however, increase the overall aid to Palestinians by more than $73 million this year. UNRWA provides aid and basic services to Palestinians caught up in the Israel-Hamas conflict, but was thrown into crisis after Israel's accusation that 12 of the agency's 13,000 staff in Gaza were involved in the October the 7th attack last year.
We are now saying, of those 82 million, we are going to be dispersing now, so basically early next week, the first tranche of 50 million euros. The remaining 32 million, I hope you're good at math, will come later as UNRWA implements the agreement that we have found with them.
As the US presidential candidates gear up for elections this year, the contenders are leaving no stone unturned to woo voters. Republican candidate Nikki Haley will be holding a campaign event here in Washington, D.C. this Friday, as the US capital city prepares to hold its Republican presidential primary this weekend. Haley continues to travel the country in hopes of inspiring more people to cast their ballots for her. However, Haley has lost every nominating contest so far to her rival and former US President Donald Trump. Well, for more on this, DD India's Caroline Malone is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Caroline, Haley's still in the race, but what are the chances of her in the D.C. primary?
Well, this DC primary actually represents one of the only chances that Nikki Haley has of actually winning a primary in the Republican race. If she gets more than 50% of the vote, she could get as many as 19 delegates. Those are essentially points that count towards who eventually does become the candidate for the Republican Party. And she is likely to have a chance here because there are more moderate voters. It's usually more Democratic leaning in the District of Columbia. So the representation of voters here are more likely to go for her type of policies than what we've seen from Donald Trump. However, overall, Nikki Haley, stands only a very little chance of actually becoming the candidate for the Republican Party because Donald Trump has won so many primaries so far and is likely to continue doing so. He won, of course, in Iowa, in New Hampshire, even in South Carolina, that's Nikki Haley's home state. She did get 40% of the vote there. That shows she is still relevant, but she is not otherwise winning. We are going to be moving forward next week into Super Tuesday. That's when we have at least 15 states and a single district as well holding their primary elections. Trump, again, likely to win a vast majority of those, although Nikki Haley could do well in places such as Texas. But overall, yes, it does really look like Donald Trump is highly likely to be the Republican presidential candidate.
Well, in that case, Caroline, why is Haley remaining in the race when there's very little chance of her winning that nomination off of Trump?
Well, that is the ultimate question, absolutely. Why is she still fighting for this position? And, we can only really speculate at this point, but I think one important thing that we can read into this is Nikki Haley's trying to represent an alternative to Donald Trump. She's trying to give voters really a choice between what Trump is representing, his MAGA policies, and something slightly more moderate. She's also been speaking to media, including in the state of Virginia, which is just neighbouring to here in the District of Columbia, and they're holding their Super Tuesday primaries just a few days' time. And she's been saying she thinks that all of Trump's court cases should be completed. There should be decisions on that before November. That may be wishful thinking, though, because we've only just heard recently that the Supreme Court here in DC will hear whether Trump is actually immune to being heard in some of these cases because of being president around the time of some of the cases that are relevant. That includes one that is surrounding the January 6th Capitol attack. That's when his supporters stormed into the Capitol. Insurrection is the word that's being used by a lot of people in the charges against him. If the Supreme Court starts to hear that case in around April, we may not get a decision until around June, which means that court case can't even start till after that. So if we look at a realistic timeline, that case certainly may not happen until later in the year. Now, in New York, they will be hearing and starting a case against Trump at the end of March. That's another criminal case about hush money payments. But again, even though Nikki Haley wants to see a conclusion to these cases, it is still highly likely that these will be rolling on into the end of the year and maybe even into next year and after that. But Nikki Haley, nonetheless, still trying to stay relevant and represent an alternative to voters.
Caroline, thank you. That was Caroline Malone joining us live from Washington, D.C. Well, a Florida judge is holding a hearing later on Friday to determine a schedule for when one of Donald Trump's criminal cases will go to trial. This case centres around Trump's handling of classified documents after he left office. It comes after Judge Eileen Cannon this week denied his co-defendant's bid to review the records they allegedly moved for the former president. DD India's US correspondent William Denslow reports.
This hearing will focus on a few key details, including legal wranglings over evidence, potential document redactions, and the trial's timeline. In a win for prosecutors earlier this week, Judge Eileen Cannon denied a request from Donald Trump's co-defendants, Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira, to review documents they're accused of helping Donald Trump to conceal. Both men face charges relating to destroying or concealing documents, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and making false statements. Nauta and de Oliveira have both pleaded not guilty. In her ruling that could well speed up legal proceedings, the judge said the special counsel had met the burden to withhold classified discovery, and that reviewing the materials wouldn't be useful in their defence. Cannon must still rule on whether Donald Trump's legal team can access a batch of classified materials that the Justice Department deems sensitive to national security. The former president has also pleaded not guilty to charges that he kept hold of classified documents at his Florida home after leaving the White House and obstructing efforts to recover them. The trial is currently scheduled for May and is one of 4 criminal cases that Trump faces as he aims to regain the presidency in November's election. He denies wrongdoing in all these cases and says the US justice system has been weaponized against him. William Denslow in New York reporting for DD India.
US President Joe Biden and Republican frontrunner Donald Trump visited the US-Mexico border in Texas on Thursday. The duo visited the border as the migrant issue takes centre stage among voters, with the city of Eagle Pass in Texas becoming a flashpoint in the debate. Biden, in his speech, condemned Republican lawmakers for rejecting efforts to strengthen immigration policies, while Trump chose inflammatory language to describe the border issue and slam his rival's policies. The United States Senate has passed a short-term spending package to avoid a government shutdown. The bill, that's the 4th such stopgap measure, was approved in a bipartisan 77-13 vote. It'll help to run the federal government agencies through March the 8th and some of the other agencies through March the 22nd, preventing a shutdown that would have kicked in on Saturday. The bill will now be sent for the final approval to President Joe Biden, helping prevent disruption to numerous government functions. A planned mission to the International Space Station has been delayed due to bad weather. SpaceX delayed its first NASA astronaut launch of 2024 once again, citing unfavourable weather conditions in the US state of Florida. Officials say the launch will now be attempted at 9:46 a.m. IST on Sunday. DD India's Sally Patterson reports.
A SpaceX rocket is due to launch 4 astronauts to the International Space Station this weekend. Liftoff is planned to take place at Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in the US state of Florida. The people on board are NASA astronauts Matthew Dominic, Michael Barrett, Jeanette Epps, and Russian cosmonaut Alexander Grabenkin. SpaceX originally designed its Dragon crew capsule to carry up to 7 astronauts, but so far the company has only flown a maximum of 4 people at a time. Now they're due to embark on a 6-month mission to the ISS and will relieve their colleagues from the Crew 7 mission. But the latest mission has been delayed several times. It was due to head off in February, but got pushed back. And now the crew's takeoff has been postponed again because of weather concerns. NASA wrote in an update that unfavourable weather conditions were expected in offshore areas along the flight track of the Dragon spacecraft. The liftoff will be broadcast live online. Sally Patterson in New York, reporting for DD India.
Well, that's it from me here in Washington, D.C. Tanvi, back to you in the studio.
Thank you so much, Nick. Nick Harper joining us all from Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global, still to come on the show. Iran votes for a new parliament today amid mounting discontent for the clerical establishment's legitimacy. Imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate Nargis Mohammadi calls these elections a sham. And Elon Musk sues ChatGPT maker OpenAI and its CEO Sam Altman for abandoning original mission meant for developing artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity. Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. On to Asia now. Iran is voting for a new parliament on Friday. Voting in legislative and key assembly polls were ongoing when reports last came in. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was the first to cast his vote today. The ballots will mostly be counted manually and partial results are expected to be announced on the 2nd of March. The voting is seen as a litmus test for the clerical establishment's popularity and legitimacy amid growing public discontent over economic, political and social strains. On the same day, Iran is also holding elections to pick 88 members of a powerful clerical body known as the Assembly of Experts. The Interior Ministry said over 15,000 candidates will run for the 290-seat parliament and partial results may appear on Saturday.
Both are friends and people who are interested in the Iranian nation as well as their ill-wishers from all sides, the observer of the issue of our country and the observer of our dear nation. Pay attention to this. Make your friends happy and disappoint the ill-wishers.
World Trade Organization WTO negotiators released new draft deals after all-night talks in Abu Dhabi failed to break key deadlocks, prompting a third extension. Despite intense discussions, issues such as that of digital trade tariffs and investment divided nations. The talks underscore tensions among major economies and concerns of marginalization by smaller nations. India and China, co-members of the BRICS group of nations, have disagreed on key issues, including on investment. India is pushing for agri-reforms and refusal for extending a moratorium on digital trade tariffs, a move that has got the consensus of most governments. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, on the second leg of his visit to 3 eastern Indian states, visited West Bengal today. During his visit, Prime Minister Modi inaugurated multiple developmental projects in Arambagh town of West Bengal. These projects cater to sectors of rail, ports, oil pipeline, LPG supply and wastewater treatment. The Indian Prime Minister inaugurated Indian Oil's 518-kilometre Haldia-Barauni crude oil pipeline. The Prime Minister also inaugurated several projects to strengthen the infrastructure at Kolkata's Shyama Prasad Mukherjee port. Prime Minister Modi further inaugurated several railway projects and 3 projects related to wastewater treatment and sewerage. Earlier, the Prime Minister also visited Jharkhand. During his visit, the Prime Minister inaugurated several development projects in Jharkhand's Sindri. The projects cater to fertilizers, rail, power and coal sectors. The Prime Minister also flagged off 3 trains there. These include Devgarh-Dibrugarh train service, MEMU train service between Tata Nagar and Badampahar, and the long-haul freight train from the Shivpur station. And next we take a look at other stories making news around the world. Polish farmers protested on the border with Lithuania on Friday against the EU's Green Deal and agricultural imports from Ukraine. Farmers brought lorries to a site adjacent to the main motorway connecting Poland and Lithuania. Farmers across Europe have been protesting for weeks against constraints placed on them by EU regulations meant to tackle climate change as well as rising costs. UK's National Audit Office provides first complete breakdown of the costs of Sunak's controversial Rwanda asylum scheme. According to the officials, the costing would be over £600 million. If the scheme comes to force, that is. The British government is considering sending asylum seekers to Rwanda to deter illegal immigration via the dangerous channel crossings. Brazil's northernmost state of Roraima suffers sharp spike in wildfires as firefighters struggle to contain a blaze on Thursday. In February, the National Institute for Space Research identified at least 2002 outbreaks in Roraima, an all-time record. Brazil's federal government held meetings on Thursday to coordinate a response. Global energy-related emissions of carbon dioxide hit a record high last year as per a report of the International Energy Agency. In China, emissions from energy rose by 5.2%. That contributed around 60% of global additions of solar, wind power and electric vehicles in 2023. But energy-related emissions in the United States fell by 4.1%. Tesla CEO Elon Musk has sued ChatGPT maker OpenAI and its CEO Sam Altman for abandoning firm's founding mission. Musk alleged that Sam Altman breached its foundational mission by putting the pursuit of profit ahead of the benefit for humanity. The lawsuit comes amid an ongoing fight between the former business partners that has been simmering for years. India's economy has another good news after the recent projection of India's GDP growth rate at 8.4% for the third quarter of 2023-24 fiscal. India's benchmark stock indices continued to soar, with the Bombay Stock Exchange Sensex reaching over 1,200 points to hit a current record high of 73,819 points. The Sensex at the BSE closed at 73,750, while the Nifty 50 touched an intraday high of 22,353 today. After 20 years of studies, research and restoration, the stone giant of ancient Acragos has risen again. The Telamon, one of the colossal anthropomorphic statues that supported the architrave of the temple of the Olympian Zeus, the Olympion, symbol of the Valley of the Temples, has been brought back to an upright position. With those beautiful visuals, we wind up this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. Connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram at DD India Live. You can also find us online at ddindia.co.in. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.